My name is Alexei. 2 years ago, I went on a cruise around the Mediterranean on a huge liner. This trip promised to be unforgettable. Comfortable cabins, excellent food, entertainment programs. I took my wife and 2 children with me. We had been planning this vacation for a long time, and everything seemed perfect. The first day after sailing, we enjoyed the cruise, walked the decks, swam in the pool, played board games in the cabin. In the evening, went out for dinner at one of the restaurants on board. The food was delicious, the atmosphere was relaxed, with laughter and conversations of other passengers all around. After dinner, we went to a show that was held in the Great Hall. It was an amazing spectacle full of acrobatics and music. The next day, we decided to spend our time sightseeing in one of the ports where the liner arrived. We did some local sightseeing, took some pictures, and went back on board. Everything was going great until the 3rd day of the cruise, when strange things started happening on the liner. Early in the morning, when I went out on deck to get some fresh air, I noticed one of the crew members standing at the edge and whispering something to himself. His behavior seemed odd, but I didn't pay much attention to it. When I returned to the cabin, I found my wife worried. One of our roommates, whom we had met at dinner, had disappeared. I assumed that she had simply been delayed on an excursion or elsewhere, but it later turned out not to be the case. Her husband, whom we had also managed to be friends with, said she hadn't been back to the cabin since the evening before. The captain announced over the loudspeaker that a search operation was underway on board, but by evening the woman was still missing. We began to feel uneasy. People on board started discussing what had happened, speculating. The next day, another passenger disappeared, and this increased the fear. At first, we thought someone was just joking, but then we realized it was serious. I tried to reassure my family, saying that everything would work out and that the missing people would be found, but I was deeply worried. We decided not to let the children go away from us again and not to leave the cabin unless absolutely necessary. In the evening, when we gathered for dinner, many of the seats in the restaurant were empty. There was tension hanging in the air, and it seemed strange. People were talking in whispers, avoiding looking each other in the eye. The next day, one of the waiters disappeared. It happened right in front of several passengers. He went out on deck and disappeared. It could no longer be a mere coincidence. The captain announced that the liner was heading to the nearest port to investigate, but we realized that it could be much more serious. We tried to figure out what was going on, discussing different theories with other passengers. Some speculated that there might be a criminal on board who was killing people and hiding the bodies. Others thought it had to do with some ancient curse, but no one could give a definite answer. We became suspicious and tense. Everyone suspected the other, and the atmosphere on the liner became unbearable. My family and I stayed together, trying to avoid crowded places. Nights became especially frightening. Every sound, every rustle made us flinch. On the 4th day, another person disappeared. A young girl we had been socializing with at the pool. Her friend said she had gone to her cabin to get a towel and had not returned. With each disappearance, panic grew. Passengers began demanding explanations from the captain, but he only asked to remain calm and assured that the crew was doing everything possible to investigate. That night, I couldn't sleep. We locked the cabin doors and left the lights on. The children slept restlessly, and I lay there listening to every sound outside the door. Around midnight, I heard a soft knocking sound. I went to the door and asked who was there, but there was no answer. My heart was pounding frantically. I asked again, and this time I heard a quiet, frightened voice calling for help. I opened the door and saw a man, one of the passengers, covered in blood. He said he had been attacked. We let him inside and he told us that someone had tried to kill him. He managed to fight back and run away. We dressed his wounds and hid him in our quarters. He was in shock and couldn't really explain who had attacked him, but his story only increased our fears. These were no longer simple disappearances. Someone on board was really attacking people. The next day, the liner finally arrived in port. However, the captain informed us that no one would be allowed to leave the ship until the investigation was complete. This caused a wave of discontent among the passengers, but we realized it would be safer that way. We remained in our cabin, communicating only with our immediate neighbors. In the evening, there was another knock on the door. This time, it was a crew member who said that the captain wanted to hold a meeting with all the passengers in the main hall. We packed up and headed there. The captain looked tired and worried. He said that the crew was searching the ship thoroughly, but so far had found no sign of the missing or any signs of violence. He also asked everyone to remain calm and promised that the harbor police would begin their investigation tomorrow morning. After the meeting, we went back to the cabin. I thought about what the injured man had told me. Someone among us was indeed dangerous. We decided that we would trust no one and stick together. The night passed quietly, but in the morning we learned that another passenger was missing. It was a middle-aged man whom we often saw on deck. His wife was hysterical. She was screaming and blaming everyone around her for not doing anything. People started demanding explanations from the crew. Some passengers offered to organize their own search parties, but this could have led to more chaos. Meanwhile, the injured man we had sheltered began to recall details of the attack. He said the attacker was wearing a crewman's uniform, but he couldn't make out his face. This could have meant that the perpetrator was hiding among us, or someone on the crew was involved. We continued to stick together, but the tension on board was rising. Passengers began making makeshift barricades out of furniture, locking themselves in their cabins. Some tried to contact relatives and authorities ashore, but communications were weak and unstable. In the evening, I heard strange noises outside our cabin door. When I looked out, I saw a man in a crewman's uniform walking down the corridor with quick steps. I decided to follow him. Leaving my wife and children in the cabin, I quietly followed. We crossed several decks, and I found myself at the door of a service room. The stranger looked around and went inside. I went to the door and listened. I heard muffled voices outside the door. I decided to find out what was going on, so I opened the door cautiously. Inside were several men in crew uniforms. They were arguing about something, and there was a clear concern in their voices. I pressed myself against the wall, trying not to give away my presence, and tried to hear what they were talking about. One of them was saying that the situation was out of control and that something had to be done to calm the passengers. The other objected, saying that revealing the truth could only make the situation worse. I realized that they knew more than they were telling the passengers. We had heard the day before that the harbor police would launch an investigation but no one had seen anyone from the shore come aboard. I had a suspicion that the crew was trying to hide something important. I decided to go back to the cabin and tell my wife all about it. When I returned, my wife looked worried. She said someone was banging on the door again, but when she asked who it was, there was no answer. We decided that we needed to be extremely cautious and not trust anyone, not even crew members. The next day, another passenger went missing, and it could no longer be an accident. People began to panic, demanding an explanation from the captain. Some passengers organized their own patrols, checking the corridors and decks. The atmosphere on board became even more tense. People were afraid to leave their cabins. We stuck together, not leaving the children for a moment. In the evening, we heard sounds outside the door again. I decided that we must act decisively. Taking a heavy lamp in my hand, I walked quietly to the door and swung it open sharply. In front of me stood a young fellow, one of the passengers we had seen in the restaurant. He looked frightened and said he was seeking shelter, as he too had been attacked. We let him in and listened to his story. He said he saw several crew members taking one of the passengers away towards the service area, but when he tried to find out what was going on, he was attacked. He managed to run away and hide, but he was sure he was being watched. We realized we couldn't stay in our quarters any longer. Determined to pull ourselves together, we joined several other families who were also looking for a safe place. We gathered in one of the large halls, locked the doors, and held a vigil so that someone was constantly monitoring the situation. The night passed peacefully, but in the morning we discovered that one of the members of our group had disappeared. This was impossible. The doors were locked, and no one could have gotten out or in unnoticed. We began to suspect that one of us was playing a double game. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate. We gathered to discuss the way forward. The room was silent, with only occasional whispers. We decided that we should try to get to the captain and demand an explanation, but we had to be careful not to attract the attention of those who might be involved in the disappearances. Soon we were on our way to the captain's bridge. On the way, we were careful not to meet any of the crew. When we reached the door of the captain's cabin, it was locked. We knocked, but there was no answer. We tried to find another way in, and then we heard muffled voices behind the wall. It turned out that there was a small vent nearby through which we could hear the conversation. One of the passengers went over to it and listened. He said that the captain and several crew members were discussing an evacuation plan. They were talking about leaving the ship immediately before the situation got out of control. We realized that the captain and crew may know more than they are saying. They may already know who is behind the disappearances and are just trying to save their lives. We decided that we had to urgently look for a way to leave the liner before it was too late. At this point, one of our group members suggested that we find lifeboats and prepare them for launching. We agreed, split into groups, and went in search of life rafts. We split into 2 groups to act faster. Our group went to the upper decks to check the condition of the lifeboats and prepare them for launching. The other group went to the cabins to alert the other passengers and gather everyone in one place. As we went up on deck, we were careful not to meet any crew members. Fear and tension hung in the air. We made our way to the lifeboats and found many of them closed and locked. We started looking for keys or ways to open them. At this time, another group returned with passengers. Some of them were in a panic, but we tried to calm them down and explained that we were planning an evacuation. Finally, we found the keys to the lifeboats and started to open them. At this point, several crew members appeared on deck. They looked alarmed and tried to stop us. We didn't know who to believe and decided to act decisively. One of the passengers, a stout man, got into a fight with one of the crew to give us time. We managed to open some dinghies and start boarding. People rushed to take their seats. Fear was evident on their faces. At this point, the captain approached us. He said he had a plan, but we had to obey his commands. We realized that we had no other choice. The captain explained that the crew had already made a distress call and help would be arriving soon. He said that we should hold the liner in place so that rescuers could easily find us. We decided to trust him and went back on deck. A few hours later, the lights of Coast Guard ships appeared on the horizon. We were relieved. Rescuers arrived and the evacuation began. People began to be transferred to safer ships. My family and I also got on one of the rescue ships. After everyone was evacuated, an investigation began. It turned out that there was indeed a criminal aboard the liner, one of the passengers who had used his position to kidnap and assault. The crew knew about him, but couldn't apprehend him because he was threatening people's lives. Eventually, we all made it back home. This journey changed our lives forever. We became more cautious, more appreciative of every day we spent together. The airliner was decommissioned, and the perpetrator was apprehended and brought to justice. But the memory of those terrible days on board will stay with us forever.